Today marks day 79 since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Think about that for a second. Nearly 80 days have passed since this 84-year-old woman vanished from her own home in Tucson, Arizona. No clear answers, no confirmed sightings, just questions that continue to build with each passing day. In today's episode, I'm diving into some new developments in the case, details that could potentially shift the direction of the investigation, or at the very least, give us a better understanding of what might be going on behind the scenes. Let's start with something you might remember from earlier in the case, the 2 ransom notes that were sent to television stations in Arizona. These notes caught a lot of attention at the time, especially because Savannah Guthrie herself later mentioned that she believed at least 2 of those messages were genuine. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. We've recently learned about activity linked to a Bitcoin account that appears to be connected to those ransom notes. According to new information, there was a transaction made on February 10th, right around the same time those letters first surfaced. The transaction itself wasn't large, but what stood out was the message attached to it. The note said, "We are ready to talk. Contact us." It also included a link, presumably a way to establish communication. Now, here's the thing. We don't know for sure who sent that message. It could have been the FBI trying to initiate controlled contact. It could have been someone from the Guthrie family attempting to reach out. Or it could even be something else entirely. But based on the timing and the context, it does seem likely that it came from someone trying to engage with whoever was behind those ransom demands. To better understand what this might mean, I spoke with retired FBI agent Steve Moore, a familiar face on this show, and someone who has real, hands-on experience with cases like this. I wanted to know, if that message did come from investigators,
was surprised that there hasn't been another attempt, either by the FBI or the family, to re-engage through that Bitcoin account. His answer? Not really. And the reason is simple. We don't know what investigators know. Inside the FBI, especially on a case this complex, there isn't just one person making decisions. There's a whole team, case agents, supervisors, higher-level officials, all weighing in on strategy. And according to Steve, it would actually be unusual if there wasn't disagreement within that team. Some might argue for taking a more aggressive approach, reaching out again, offering money, trying to provoke a response. Others might strongly oppose that, pointing out the risks, not just to this case, but to future cases as well. Because every decision sets a precedent. And that brings us to a critical point, the balance between emotion and strategy. From the family's perspective, the situation is unimaginable. If this were your mother, your loved one, you wouldn't be thinking about long-term consequences or negotiation tactics. You'd want action. You'd want answers. You'd do whatever it takes to bring them back. And that emotional response is completely understandable. But from an investigative standpoint, things are different. The FBI has to consider the bigger picture. They have to ask difficult questions. Is this a legitimate ransom situation? Are the people behind these messages acting in good faith? Is there even a realistic chance of recovery? Because if the answer to those questions is no, then continuing to engage, especially financially, could do more harm than good. Steve also raised a major concern, the behavior of whoever sent those ransom messages. From the very beginning, there were red flags. There was no proof of life provided, no indication that Nancy was safe, and instead of communicating privately, which is typical in genuine ransom cases, the messages were sent through media outlets. That's highly unusual. In fact, it suggests that whoever is behind this may not be acting with real intent to negotiate at all. And if that's the case, then this might not be a traditional kidnapping scenario. It could be something else entirely. Now, building on everything we've discussed so far, I wanted to go deeper into another major aspect of this case, criminal profiling. Because behind the scenes, this is one of the key tools investigators rely on when there are very few hard leads. Over the past week, I've spoken with multiple retired FBI profilers, people who have spent years studying patterns of behavior in cases just like this. And one of the most interesting perspectives came from a profiler who based his analysis almost entirely on statistics. His point was simple, but powerful. In a significant majority of cases involving violence against women, the person responsible is someone the victim knew in some capacity. Now, to be clear, we don't know exactly what happened to Nancy. There's still no confirmation of whether this was a kidnapping for ransom, something personal, or something else entirely. But statistically speaking, the idea that the person involved may have had some level of familiarity with Nancy is something investigators would absolutely consider. When I brought this up with Steve, he didn't necessarily disagree, but he did offer an important distinction. He pointed out that not all crimes fall into the same category. For example, the statistics around murders don't always translate directly to ransom-style cases.
Abductions. Those are very different types of crimes, often with very different motives and patterns. However, when it comes to abductions in general, there is still a strong trend. Many victims do, in fact, know their abductor, even if only briefly or indirectly. So what does that mean for this case? It means investigators would likely be looking far beyond just close family and friends. They would be examining anyone who may have crossed paths with Nancy over the years. Contractors, service workers, acquaintances, even casual contacts. And according to Steve, this kind of investigation can go back a long time, possibly even a decade or more. Think about that. Every financial transaction, every service appointment, every person who entered her home or had access to her information, all of it becomes relevant. Investigators would likely go through bank records, looking at who she paid and when. They would review social media activity, phone records, anything that could reveal patterns or connections. And while that might sound overwhelming, there's a method to it. Over time, many of those individuals are no longer relevant. They may have moved away, changed circumstances, or simply don't fit the profile. What remains is a smaller group of people who can be examined more closely. Another point raised by one of the profilers was the idea that the suspect may appear unafraid. This assessment came from analyzing available footage and behavior patterns. The way the individual moved, the apparent confidence, it suggested someone he wasn't overly concerned about being caught. When I asked Steve about that, he didn't push back on it. In fact, he said that if a profiler describes someone that way, it's something investigators would take seriously. An unafraid suspect could indicate a level of confidence, or even overconfidence, someone who believes they won't be identified.
That can reveal a lot, because every crime has a motive, and understanding that motive is often the key to understanding the crime itself. If this were a financial crime, you'd look for someone who stands to gain money. If it were personal, you'd look for someone with a grudge, a history, a reason for resentment. And in this case, there are still many unknowns. One possibility that's been discussed is retaliation, someone acting out of anger, revenge, or perceived wrongdoing. This becomes particularly relevant when you consider the connection to a public figure like Savannah Guthrie. Public visibility can sometimes attract unwanted attention. It can lead to individuals developing unhealthy fixations or grievances, people who feel wronged, even if that perception isn't based in reality. Steve mentioned that in cases involving media personalities, it's not uncommon to encounter individuals who have become obsessed. These individuals may follow every detail, interpret statements in personal ways, and sometimes act on those interpretations. If that's the case here, investigators would likely be looking into anyone who has shown unusual interest in Nancy or Savannah, especially those who have attempted to make contact or expressed strong opinions publicly. And that kind of investigation can stretch far beyond the immediate area. As Steve explained, he once worked on a case where the suspects were located several states away, connected not by proximity, but by ideology. All of this highlights just how complex this case really is. There isn't one clear path. There isn't one obvious answer. Instead, there are multiple possibilities,
each one requiring careful analysis, patience, and attention to detail. Now, as we move further into the details of this case, there are a few more critical areas that investigators and experts are closely examining. And one of
Back information isn't about secrecy. It's about protecting the integrity of the case. Now, shifting to another major development, something that could potentially play a huge role moving forward: DNA evidence. We've recently learned that a hair found at Nancy Guthrie's home has now been sent for advanced testing. Originally, this evidence had been analyzed at a lab in Florida, but now it's being transferred to the FBI's lab in Quantico for further examination. And that could be significant, because when it comes to forensic evidence, even the smallest detail can make a difference. Steve explained that in a situation like this, investigators would want to collect as much physical evidence as possible, especially from areas where contact likely occurred, such as bedding or clothing. The idea is simple. It's almost impossible for someone to enter a space, interact with objects or a person, and leave without leaving something behind. Hair, fibers, skin cells, these are all potential clues. But not all evidence is equal. With hair, for example, there's a big difference between a strand that includes the root and one that doesn't. If the root is present, it can provide a much stronger DNA sample. Without it, the amount of usable DNA is more limited, but still potentially helpful, especially with newer technology. And that's another important point. Technology is constantly improving. What might not have been useful evidence a few years ago could now provide valuable information, thanks to advancements in forensic science. So the fact that this hair is being re-examined at a higher-level lab suggests that investigators believe it could be important. It doesn't guarantee a breakthrough, but it's definitely a step worth watching. Another theory that's been discussed involves the possibility of multiple people being involved. One profiler suggested that this may not have been the work of a single individual, that there could be a